Time now to discuss the latest on the Fed. Last week's Fed announcement, the central bank's path from here. For insight, I'm joined by Danielle DiMartino Booth, CEO and Chief Strategist for QI Research. Danielle, first up, milestone for you. Congratulations on 10 years of operation for your firm and doing macroeconomic analysis. So let's get into that macro analysis and let's talk a little bit about the Fed. So you had Governor Waller on Friday saying that the central bank could cut rates as soon as July. What's your perspective on that? Because I don't think the market was expecting that.
Well, so we've seen Governor Waller be a little bit more dovish than the other members of the FOMC committee. He appears to be paying closer attention to what we're seeing out of the labor market as opposed to just looking through the sole lens of what we're seeing with inflationary pressures. In my view, at least, I think Christopher Waller said out loud what many of us have been thinking, and that it is time for the Fed to start leaning more heavily on its second employment mandate, because we're simply not seeing the pass through to inflation from the potential risk of tariffs come through in other data. We're seeing inflation, in fact, very well behaved. So I think it was right for Waller to point out, you know what, we're not going to let the employment mandate completely run amok. We're going to be paying closer attention to that. Maybe not September, maybe as soon as July.
Okay, I have heard some viewpoints that, we're starting to see cracks in the labor market, and you can see the trend playing out. For instance, when we look at weekly jobless claims, they're coming in lower week by week, not significant breakdown. And look, you had the semi-annual report from the Fed to Congress on Friday showing the view was that the labor market is still being described as being in solid shape. Jobs growing at a moderate pace. The unemployment rate is low. I want to dig more into employment in your perspective. Do you think we're in the early stages of a slow unraveling, or do you expect things to be slow and then all of a sudden we have a deterioration in the job market?
Well, Diane, the way you describe it is typically how the labor market plays out. We've seen successive upticks in the initial jobless claims number, the 4-week moving average, which we economists use to smooth out what can be a very noisy series, is at the absolute cycle high. Continuing jobless claims, the number of Americans collecting unemployment benefits and not able to get a new job if they do lose their, which of course Chair Powell spoke to when he was at the podium when the Fed last met, is basically the message is if you lose your job, don't do it. Don't lose your job. It's a really hard environment in which to get another job. We heard from Intel going into the weekend, they're going to be laying off another 10,000, this time without severance. Amazon, Microsoft, we've heard a fourth wave of layoffs coming out of Silicon Valley. And it looks like this particular increase in the unemployment rate, which on an unrounded basis is at a post-pandemic high, all of the indicators suggest that Chair Powell's the last of the Mohicans standing, so to speak, still using that term solid to describe the labor market when most other indicators are going the other direction, Diane.
And then, Danielle, I want to ask you about some of the regional survey data, the regional Fed surveys. You say those are strong forward indicators. So, when you think about some of the weakness we've seen, say, for instance, in the Empire and Philly Fed, what does that signal to you about the broader economic picture?
Well, Diane, especially through the prism of the employment sub-indexes in the Philly Fed, which we had out on Friday. In fact, the employment index decline of more than 26% on a 1-month basis, the pandemic notwithstanding. That was the largest 1-month decline in that employment index going back to data to 1968. Looking at the state of New York, it is by far the highest intensity services state in the nation. The state of New York relies the most on services, which is, of course, 80% of the U.S. economy. We use that as a bellwether, as a proxy for the nation as a whole. And again, we've seen some of the most dramatic declines in the history of that survey on the employment side. So again, what we're hearing early on before this morning's, we get that at 9:45 a.m. Eastern, before we hear what S&P Global has to say about the nation as a whole, everything's pointing towards weakening labor, weakening labor. And by the way, that Philly Fed index showed one of the biggest declines in prices paid that we've seen already. So again, you know, loosening inflationary pressures and heightening employment pressures at the same time.
Got it. What are you expecting from the PMIs today?
Well, given the unexpected weakness that we saw in the headlines out of New York, out of the Philly Fed, we're looking for a little bit of downside when we see those print this morning. I think that there was a sigh of relief in Germany, in France, in the UK overnight, that their PMIs did not deteriorate any more meaningfully. But I'm going to have to put a big asterisk on all the data that we're getting out, because these surveys were, of course, conducted prior to this past weekend's attack in the United States joining in the Israeli effort in Iran.
Danielle, I'm curious to know a couple. We've got a good chunk of economic data this week. A lot of it's on the housing market, but of course, we've got the PMIs today, and at the end, later in the week, we've got both PCE and consumer sentiment. Now, it seems like we're starting to go back to a pre-pandemic world on sentiment, where it was a leading indicator. Do you think that's where, even though we did see some improvement again recently, do you think that's where we're headed? And are you worried at all about that data?
I am. In fact, you bring up Friday's final print on consumer confidence. That's actually going to incorporate some of the even more heightened certainty that we've seen since this weekend. And yes, after we kind of had a brief blip of enthusiasm and optimism in November and December, that we're in the immediate aftermath of the presidential election, we have indeed seen a lot of these sentiment readings come back down. Your average working man, working woman in the United States is still contending with the pandemic hangover of stubbornly high prices. But again, at this point, with a weakening labor market, we're starting to see reflections of either they've lost their job or they know somebody who's lost their job, 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And we are indeed seeing that play out in the sentiment figures. I'm paying much more close attention to them, Diane.
Danielle, I want to give you we have about a minute left, but I want to hear your thought on what you would say to Fed Chair Jerome Powell as it relates to the path for interest rates from here. If you could, just say one thing to him.
And of course, he'll be up on the Hill tomorrow with his semi-annual testimony. And I would simply say you're going to be asked by a lot of individuals in Congress, why are you not paying heed to the plight of working men and working American who either are underemployed, they're making less than they would otherwise if they were working full-time. We're seeing some of the highest number of part-timers for economic reasons in U.S. history. Why are you leaning so hard on that inflation mandate when our constituents are saying in no uncertain terms, the job market is nothing of the solid that you describe? I think he'll get a lot of grilling when he gets up to the Hill this week.
All right, Danielle, thank you. That's Danielle DiMartino Booth, QI Research. Congratulations again on 10 years of QI Research.